I have one visual aid for you today. The others didn't appear. I'm talking about the resurrection appearances. I might also be talking about the visual disappearances, but never mind. I have, never mind, one visual aid. It's an LP, and it's the musical Godspell. The reason is, a couple of weeks ago, I was in touch with a friend of mine called Tony, a school friend. It's coming up to 50 years ago when we put on a production of Godspell at school. Tony was the acting director, and I was the musical director. There it is. The reason I show this to you is that at the end of Godspell, there is a mystery, a missing piece from the jigsaw. The cast carry the body of Jesus off the stage, and as they carry him, they lift him high. We've been singing, "Lord, I lift your name on high." Well, they lift the body, and some people say, yes, that shows there's a resurrection. Later on, Jesus appears on the stage singing the reprise song. Other people say, yes, shows there's a resurrection. Well, the composer who wrote the music, he said, I'm leaving it to people to make up their own minds. It's the same with Jesus Christ Superstar. You may, if you remember seeing the film, the very last shot is of an empty cross. And some people would say, empty cross, resurrection. Well, it's ambiguous. We just don't know. Or do we? How do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? We have to ask about the resurrection, the question, not only whether it happened, but whether it matters whether it happened. This is the gospel I preached to you, says Paul, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. You're wasting your time. How do we know that Jesus rose from the dead? Do you remember the old song? You ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. But faith is not a blind leap in the dark without any historical evidence. The Bible's evidence is strong, even though there may be difficulties to be resolved. Our reading is just one small part of the evidence. Paul's repeated phrase, according to the scriptures, emphasizes the divinely inspired witness provided by the Old Testament prophets. And then in the book of Acts, we read, he showed himself alive by many convincing proofs and instructed his apostles and many other followers over the next 40 days. We're in that period now, that period of liturgy, or should I say lectionary. Anyway, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul includes a summary statement that provides information about the resurrection appearances and others which are not recorded in the Gospels or in Acts. John Stott puts it like this. In the resurrection appearances, there is a great variety of circumstances of place, person, and mood in which they occurred. He appeared in the garden of the tomb, in the upper room, on the road to Emmaus, by the Sea of Galilee, on a Galilean mountain, and on the Mount of Olives, near Jerusalem. Jesus was seen by individuals alone, by small groups, and by more than 500 people altogether. Now, it has been pointed out that in this passage, women are excluded from Paul's list. Why? After all, it was the women who saw Jesus first. Last week, David Packham told us that Mary Magdalene is known as the apostle to the apostles. It needed the women to convince the men that Jesus was alive. As we know, there are still many contexts in which women struggle today to make their voice heard, be it in over education and representation in Afghanistan, or rape and other instances of injustice in our own country. Yet, God clearly chose the women to be the first witnesses to the greatest event in history. What does come across in Jesus Christ Superstar is the devotion of Mary Magdalene when she sings her song, "I Don't Know How to Love Him." There's a line there which says, "I've been changed, yes, really changed." Archbishop Michael Ramsey made the comment that Godspell presents a lot of Christianity because of itself, and indeed it was part of my coming to faith. But Jesus Christ Superstar presents a little Christianity in spite of itself. To return to John Stott, Mary Magdalene was weeping, the women were afraid and astonished, Peter was full of remorse, and Thomas was full of incredulity. The Emmaus pair were distracted by the events of the week, the disciples were distracted by their fishing. Yet through all their doubts and preoccupations, through their unbelief and the risen Lord made himself known to them. Now, many people would say, people don't rise from the dead today, so why believe that Jesus did all those years ago? Let's turn our attention to Thomas, with whom many people today would say they could particularly identify with. Thomas had missed out on the greatest event in history, or so he thought. After 8 days, Jesus appeared again, and he responded to Thomas's need, using exactly the same words that Thomas himself had used before. Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. And Thomas was convinced by what he saw. And according to the gospel account, became the first person ever to declare his personal allegiance to Jesus as his Lord and God. This marks the highest level of faith recorded in the Gospel of John. Listen to the opening verses of the first letter of John from the Message. It might just as well have been written by Thomas. From the very first, we were there, taking it all in. We heard it with our own ears, saw it with our own eyes, verified it with our own hands. The word of life, that's Jesus, appeared right before our eyes. We saw it happen. The great Baptist preacher Spurgeon wrote this: "The resurrection is one of the best attested facts on record. There were so many witnesses to behold it. These persons could not every one of them have been so positively deceived. They were ready to die for their faith in the risen Lord. Can there be any other explanation? Can that account for the explosive growth of the church and its persistence throughout history? The church did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the church." To claim that the resurrection did not happen takes as much faith as to claim that it did. And faith is not a blind leap in the dark without historical evidence. In the book of Acts, whenever the apostles are preaching, the center of their faith is Jesus, who was crucified and risen. One example, Acts 2:24. God raised him from the dead because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. This is the gospel, my friends, on which we have taken our stand. Now, two people who are really changed by their encounter with the risen Christ were the disciples on their way to Emmaus. So sorry I don't have the visual there, but hands up if you've been to the National Gallery. And do you remember Caravaggio's wonderful painting of the supper at Emmaus? It's my favorite resurrection picture and my favorite Caravaggio picture as well. Jesus is the kind of familiar stranger to these two men. After talking with them on the road, they beg him to stay with them. Then he takes bread, gives thanks, breaks it, and gives it to them. Now that painting captures this dramatic moment when it captures it perfectly, when one of those disciples practically leaps out of his chair and the other stretches out his hands in amazement. But of course, there's a symbol there too. Stretches out in his hands. It's the crucifixion he's remembering. It's him. And of course, you can just about see one of Jesus' hands, the marks. Jesus transformed the disciples' minds by explaining everything that was said in the scriptures concerning him. He transformed the disciples' hearts, and he still makes our hearts burn within us, doesn't he, when we read the scriptures today, as we celebrate also in our communion services. This is why we can sing, "He lives within my heart." And finally, he transformed the disciples' lives by commissioning them and us to tell the good news to everyone. For Paul, writing to the Romans, the resurrection of Jesus from death to life proves that he was more than just a man. That event established that he was in fact the Son of God. Paul says it is of first importance. The perfect life, obedient death, and life-giving resurrection of Jesus should be thought of as one saving work, one combined and inseparable act of God, as we've just sung. From the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky, Lord, I lift your name on high. What does it mean to live in the light of this truth? What are the implications for us today? We know we're facing really tough times at the moment, and they're not going to get easier anytime soon. But we live in the light of the resurrection. This is how Paul ends chapter 15 of his letter to the Corinthians. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. What would you say was of first importance to you? Can we say with Paul, I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection? Or, in the words of the popular song from Godspell, day by day, day by day. Oh, dear Lord, three things I pray: to see thee more clearly, love thee more dearly, follow thee more nearly, day by day. Amen.